All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time and effort in joining such an important conversation. So you are in the webinar, Urban Resilience and Social Innovation in San Francisco and China's Bay Areas. And we consider this as a very fresh and timely topic when we talk about resiliencies in a time of crisis and think out of the box and out of the region to try to understand what's the best practices and effective tools to help our community to become more resilient. So I am your host today. For those who know me, hi Bruce. It's
Hi,
finally here.
Jesse.
Hi, so good to have you with us. So we have three distinguished speakers today. We have Francis, Bruce, and Max. I'm going to introduce them later on. But a bit of context of today's topic. We are in a very unprecedented time where the communities are facing uncertainties. When we are being individuals, we have lots of unsettled decisions to make. However, when we're in the community, we have lots of channels and platforms to discuss what is the best way to react, to cope. And that is why we're here today. And we're trying to find a new angle to understand what we can act upon as individuals. And that is why we always bring social innovation as the center of our community's mission. So at Social Entrepreneur Meetup, we believe that social innovation and social entrepreneurship is a lifestyle to have individuals believing in themselves to be a change agent, to take action, take initiative, to create better living environment for the community. So we're bringing the two Bay Areas in comparison because they share lots of similarities despite the differences. So both, as you might know, are the center of innovation and high-tech sectors. In the San Francisco Bay Area, 12% of the employment are in the high-tech sectors. And in the China's Bay Area, the R&D actually counts the top of the nation's R&D expenditure, which is 13% of national GDP. So given all the figures, we can associate the technology development with the social problems, which are also shared across the Bay Area, including the social inequality, income inequality, housing crisis, and a lot more. That's why we put the two Bay Area in comparison for us to think out of the box and out of the region to find the best practices and really learn from each other. So today we have three distinguished speakers. I would like to briefly introduce themselves. So we have Bruce, and Bruce is based in San Francisco. And thank you so much for joining us in the evening time. Bruce is a lecturer at Stanford School of Engineering. He is also the co-founder and CEO of Urban Logic, and he'll be able to introduce you a lot more. And Bruce is also an Ashaka Fellow. So Francis is based in Hong Kong, and he's a director. You can say hi to everybody. Yeah, this is Francis. He's a director of Hong Kong's initiative of the Rustandy Center for Social Innovation at the Chicago booth of Hong Kong. And he also worked across the sector. So Francis can actually offer a very holistic view on how does social innovation mean from the perspective of nonprofit, the government, private banks, charitable trusts, and education sectors. So very all-rounded. And last but not least, we have Max. Max is an amazing change maker. He's an investor, a serial entrepreneur, and a Schwarzman scholar from Tsinghua University. He started Brown University's first startup acceleration program, and he was a teaching fellow at Singularity University. He has also started a few AI-based startups focusing on driving social changes and innovation. So thank you so much for being with us today. Without further ado, I really love to give time for each one of you to talk about a bit more about what you are doing, the exciting projects you have done and you're currently undergoing. And in the context of this webinar, we're talking more into the social innovation and building community resilience. So maybe you can tap a little bit into that, right? What is your social innovation passion? How did you start it? So maybe we can have Bruce to go first because we're so excited to have you from another side of the world. So Bruce, please introduce yourself.
Well, many thanks to you, Jesse, and to Max, certainly for many years of inspiration when he was here at Stanford. And I'm actually in Palo Alto, right near Stanford. It's a beautiful night, so I thought I would bring you outside. Um, and let's see, I teach a number of classes at Stanford, including the ethics of finance and financial engineering, understanding the buy side of Wall Street, sustainable banking, and most recently and currently in this quarter, redesigning finance for post-disaster scenarios, which when we started planning that course about 3 years ago, we didn't expect COVID. We were dealing with wildfires that are often seasonal here in California, but we've pivoted online as much of Stanford has to focus on COVID. Um, my passions include, as an Ashoka Fellow, as you say, making sure that we have the financial engineering for social design. Too often I see great ideas and fantastic, passionate social entrepreneurs who have to beg, borrow, and steal to get their entrepreneurial activities started and then continued. And they often, as with many startups, don't last beyond the founder's vision or tenure.
Mm.
So financing and innovating financing is something I'm passionate about. Um, some of the things that I'm working on, Max knows a little of this, include a periodic table of quality of life elements using government finance data to price the value of impacts. We often like to wave our hands as social entrepreneurs and talk about impacts, but the actual market price of them is what it would cost the government to achieve them per capita. So the periodic table of quality of life helps us do that. Um, Sustainable finance is a big topic. We can't go through all of that today, but it clearly is something that the banks, given their lack of safety and soundness under the Basel Accords, need to fund the real economy, and banks that fund projects and enterprises that build impacts that are countable in the real economy should be stronger financially as banks, and that would help. And then I guess two others worth mentioning. One is repurposing gift card breakage.
Mm.
What happens to those lost gift cards? Where's the money? How do we use that in the social sphere? And creating a GEM, a general economic model that links people who live in slums or live in poverty to those of us who do not, so that they can be full economic citizens and we can pay them for reducing impacts such as public health impacts that would be very expensive if we didn't help them with that. So that's a very fast uh, update on me.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm sure that this is the episode, but you have a lot more actually behind each line of description. So yeah, we would love to learn more from you actually, during and after the webinar once we're connected. So yeah, maybe we can give the time to Max to talk a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the organization that you've put into this, Jesse, and all of the wonderful people who've come up to join us in this discussion. I was very fortunate to live in both the sort of South Bay, San Francisco area and work there as a data scientist. And then also in the last few years, I've spent a lot of time here in Hong Kong and Shenzhen as well. Personally, I originally started out studying biomedical engineering with a focus on the tools that we can use to make new types of life capabilities. And then through an accidental discovery and internship in NASA Ames in California, became exposed to the world of tech entrepreneurship and really fell in love with the spirit and philosophy of being able to imagine and build incredible things in the Silicon Valley area, and worked there actually for a professor who came out of Stanford and built a machine learning data science company after college. And then I briefly went back to, started a project with a professor of mine at Brown, and then came to Asia in 2016 and had a chance to attend this really unique, interesting master's program in Beijing called Schwarzman Scholars, where it was more focused on finance and geopolitics, and then spent the last few years working for 2 family offices here in Hong Kong before starting our own project. I think the thing I want to highlight and sort of dive into more, and been really lucky to actually learn from Bruce over the number of years that I've had a chance to know him and hear about his projects, is the way that we can actually drive more large-scale capital into projects that seemingly are not immediately attractive investment opportunities, but on the longer picture actually create the foundations upon which societies can function meaningfully. I think when we think about capitalism, it's a very narrow sense of the word, and as a result, a lot of times we underinvest in people, in the community, and also in emergency response. And whenever there's a crisis, we sort of then react to it too late. So that's a topic that I would like to discuss, and very particular segment of it I'm personally now focused in is the area around climate change and climate finance.
Thank you very much, Max. I think you brought up very good points that how we should be, preparing for the rainy days, right? By investing in what is already built there, right? The capitalist system, by not discussing it or complaining about it, but actually think about innovative way to build a resilient ecosystem around it. So thank you very much to be with us. And last but not least, let's introduce Francis, based in Hong Kong, from Chicago booth of Hong Kong.
Hi, welcome everyone, and it's good to be sharing with you all, and thank you, Jesse and everyone, for having me. So I'm Francis from the Rustandi Center for Social Sector Innovation, and I'm based in Hong Kong. So Rustandi Center is what we call the social innovation hub for the Chicago Booth Business School, and really our mission in the States and also, I think especially in this part of the world, is to try to bridge between the knowledge that we have built in the university and in particular the business school, and to help the social sector. And the thinking behind is that business school is not really now just about business. It's not about profit making. It's not just about maximizing shareholder value. It's more about maximizing the well-being of society and the world. The projects that we have is that we train social sector, we train the more traditional NGOs, we train social entrepreneurs, we train startups here, and to try to bring some of the experience and knowledge that we had from the business school, and to try to really help them implement the great ideas that they have in their mind, and to bring that to the real world, and to help them face all the challenges that they may face, so that they can create a real impact. So I agree totally with Bruce and Max that I think sometimes the challenge is how to balance between the very good ideas that people have and all the great wishes of bringing good things to the world, and with all those financial sustainability and stuff. I think that's also my passion of really helping the NGOs and the social sector to face the challenge of the world. The other project that I'm involved in is more about helping the campus, the university's campus in Hong Kong, to think about what we want to do in Asia. So that's the other project I'm involved in, what we call 100-year lives in Asia. So the whole concept behind is that when people are living for longer, the implication is not just on themselves. It's also on family dynamics. It's on how people should plan about their career and their life. It's also about mobility, public finance, corporate governance, and stuff. So I'm also part of the effort of trying to bridge between resources in Chicago and also in Asia to think about what are the implications for when people are living for a longer life. I previously used to work for Hong Kong Jockey Club. For those who know about Jockey Club, it's the largest foundation in Hong Kong. And I was there briefly for around 1 year. Before that, I was with HSBC Private Bank, and I'm a trust person. So I think that also gives me a bit of perspective about the differences and the similarities, and also the potential collaboration between the business sector and the social sector. So I think that there's also one reason why I'm so excited about this conversation, and I look forward to sharing and learning from all of you.
Thank you very much, Francis. And I saw Bruce has already shared with everyone. There's also a lot of activity and very similar initiative at Stanford Center. Yeah, but I think today let's just really focus on community resilience and social innovation, and we can dive into that a bit later. So thank you so much for being with us. And I feel like, you know, when we are creating kind of events for everyone to create meaningful conversation, we also need to build a sound structure around it. So in this particular webinar, we are discussing social innovation in the framework of City Resilient Framework, CRF. And this is a research-based framework that categorizes the city's system or city's needs on 7 characteristics. That includes being reflective, as a city, being reflective, resourceful, inclusive, integrated, robust, redundant, and flexible. So within this framework, I would like to have our speakers to talk a little bit more about how do you categorize your own city or your own Bay Area. What are some strengths and weaknesses of your area? Are they inclusive, or that's exactly what is lacking? Because acknowledging the weaknesses of our region, can really facilitate our understanding on what social innovator could really come into helping. So I would love to give time to our speakers to talk a bit more about, also the similarity of the distinguishedness if you have lived in both areas. So let's start with Bruce, if you'd like to give a brief.
Sure. So here I have to admit to a couple of things. First of all, I did live in Hong Kong as a merchant banker in 1990 and 91. And so I very much am fond of Hong Kong. In fact, the head of Ford Foundation Asia was my mentor, and I miss him very much. He was a very dear man to me. And I saw firsthand what the entrepreneurial spirit was in Hong Kong, and growing up in Philadelphia and working also in New York for 25 years, I recognized the entrepreneurial spirit of the area. That spirit is very precious and can be easily dissipated if the work-life balance is not preserved pre and post disaster. The 100 Resilient Cities effort was started by Michael Berkowitz. Michael and I worked together at the command center after 9/11 in New York City, after the World Trade Center bombings. And what we saw there every day was the incredible ingenuity of people in crisis, not asking for official permission to do anything other than do what was right. And by having a badge, as we all did in those days, to be at the command center, we had the implicit authority to do what was right, to put together NGO and public-private partnerships to respond in the moment. If people worry that after the fact, after they take the initiative, they will be criticized for having done so. They may not be so willing to respond in the moment, and that would be very dangerous. So the social capital that exists here in the Bay Area and the social capital that I knew existed in Hong Kong, because it was a society of pure networking. This is way before Max, LinkedIn, and all of these things. People actually knew each other personally. Um, it was a matter of trust, and a matter of trust in why you wanted to accomplish something different than perhaps the mainland or anyone else had told you you should. Um, the next thing to understand is that both of our areas have been very expensive places to live, with the inequality of that problem, and that the people who are at the top and the people who sweep the floors and maintain the buildings and all the other things lead to very different lives with a very different um, tensions in those lives. What we've seen in San Francisco and the Bay Area here through the eyes of COVID is the dramatic problem of people who have no health care or very limited health care, uh, people who are homeless or are living month to month on their rent, people who are marginal or commuting an hour to two for their job each way, given the price of housing, and so that inequality has exposed everyone in the region to greater risks of COVID, not just in our sheltered in place moments, which we are still sheltered in place pretty much, but in the economic collapse that will follow, has followed. So what was inequality that needed to be addressed as a nice thing to do before, I think is now a survival thing to do.
Mm.
And the way that this area will recover as real estate to make sure people are no longer as homeless, or to make sure that the housing is more evenly priced, is a good challenge for us to have. The final thing I'll say is that we are a mixture of cultures here. We have Hispanic people from Mexico and from South America. We have Indian people. We have Asian people. We have uh, even New Yorkers here, which is a very different culture, I might tell you. Um, and um, and we all mix together, and we all stay separate in certain ways. And so there is a great uh, advantage to the diversity that is here. That is, I call it the power of random. That Max and I should find each other is random. Now, if you tried to look us up on LinkedIn and see why we should find each other, you'd have a hard time explaining it or repeating it. But we do that here, and we do it often here, and we welcome that. That was my experience of Hong Kong too, in the years that I was there. And it would be sad if the uniformity of thought were to destroy the diversity of opportunity in either of our places. So with that, I'll let it go back to you all.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I think that's a very good insight and overview on the distinctiveness and similarity across the Bay. I think it's very important that you brought up the concept of social capital, because we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, where the new incidents or the new events happening recently in Hong Kong, namely the new national security law implementation, or at the current stage, the bill is having significant effects on the society as a whole. So I think as social innovators and social entrepreneurs, we have to look at the events and the separate events holistically and really understand what is needed in a community. So Yeah, that's a great insight. And I would like to
You don't know the social capital you've lost until you need it in an emergency.
that's very true. I think let's really follow up on that. Max, maybe you can also talk a little bit about your understanding of social capital, because that's really, the foundation of a cohesive society. And yeah, through your experience, how do you feel Hong Kong different from the Bay Area in another side in terms of the social capital?
Yeah, well, first I just want to say it's always a pleasure to hear Professor Cahan speak. I think one of the key things that he emphasized a lot is actually, as we think about how we build these innovative communities, there's magic or serendipity that happens in densely clustered regions, especially places where people are very open and friendly towards each other. That creates, sort of compounding positive effects in a community. I just remember, living in Bay Area for many years, I would always be surprised at how readily people made new friends and taught and shared the knowledge they had with each other. It was a very porous, culture as well. And I think, the challenge really that both San Francisco, South Bay, and also I think Hong Kong is facing pretty dramatically today is actually that as the knowledge economy, continues to deliver huge amounts of value to its participants, the people whose lives are built on regular economy actually seeing that gap widen dramatically. Like in the last few years, as I've come back to visit the Bay Area, every few months or every half year, I've been struck by the amount of people who were struggling in addition to the people who are doing really well. You have, one of the largest concentrations of tech billionaires probably in the world. And then next to them, you have people who are still, trying to find reliable social services. And I think in some ways, Hong Kong also has this very, very abrupt juxtaposition between, the people who are living in small, tiny spaces compared to the gleaming skyscrapers and, the beachside resorts. And I think as the socially minded entrepreneurial and researchers and also founders, like it's really our job to think through, how do we actually take the rest of the people along, and help them prosper when we actually see outsized gains. I think another sort of interesting topic to touch on, and something that Professor Han mentioned, is that when we study business, usually we study business in the context of just doing really well and managing the profit and loss of the company. And for a while, that was a very effective way to organize because it sort of focused, the people's efforts on a particular measurable goal. And I think as a data science person, I always believe that if you don't measure something, you can't change it meaningfully. But I think we've been too focused actually on just driving P&L, because P&L is in itself, like in a vacuum, less meaningful than we think it might be, right? If you have a really, really immensely profitable company and then it's, situated next to a bunch of slums, like what's the point? What's the positive creation, right, of that company? What's the positive impact on that company? So as we, move into a post-COVID world, I think it's important for us to actually redefine the metrics of success that we actually look at, right? What are the things we're measuring, and how do we use those measurements actually to change the way we prioritize efforts? So I think I really believe in measuring resilience. Like you've been very articulate, Jesse, in championing, and also in measuring just like probably like development index, right? Because if you have a really strong development index measurement, then when a company makes huge amounts of profits, like it is in the interest of that company or in that government region to actually distribute the profits in the regionality in which the company's based, in order to drive up the development index. And that way, actually, we have huge amounts of compounding social prosperity. When people feel secure, when people feel they can trust each other, when people feel like they're living, their basic needs are covered, is when people feel most creative. Before then, I think we're very just single-minded on survival, and when we enter that mindset, we actually become relatively selfish. We become a little bit more closed-minded, and we become very defensive about our resources. And I think what we're going to experience is we're going to experience a period of slow down economic growth. the globalization engines that powered us for, maybe 30 years or so, they really have been reset by the COVID situation. And this is a great chance for us to define new academic and commercial thought patterns, ways that actually can rewire the way that human beings are optimized to work towards. So I'll briefly pause here.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. The compounding effect that you're pointing out here. I think I will later bring back, look back to this point about, because Bruce also mentioned about the diversity of opportunities, how to bring people across the different sectors, different race, different, even the ethnic backgrounds, and together, co-create a vision, co-create a projects. So yeah, we're definitely gonna bring back to here because the vehicle and kind of the instance of social innovation. So yeah, that's a great insight. Thank you, Max. And Francis, would you like to talk a bit more about, the city resilience framework?
Yeah, and then I would also like to echo Bruce and Max about diversity. Yeah, I agree totally with you that diversity and the ability to engage different communities and get different communities to talk to each other and collaborate with each other is probably one of the foundations for resilience. I would say that diversity in Hong Kong is facing a challenge, right? Whether it's in terms of diversity in thoughts or diversity of people's background. And when I reflect on that, I would say that it's a challenge or it's a danger that we, as a Hong Kong person, have to remind myself that it probably takes courage and perseverance to encourage myself to talk to people from different backgrounds and with different thoughts. And another aspect of diversity is that actually, although Hong Kong population is overwhelmingly Chinese, there are people with other ethnic background, right? We have Indians, we have Pakistani, we have Filipinos, we have Indonesians, not to talk about people from Europe and America and Australia and New Zealand. It often surprised me that actually those people with different ethnic background don't really talk to each other and understand each other. It may be a different story when you are talking about that you are meeting people with different ethnic background professionally, right? But if it comes to friends or people just living next to you or close to your community, we can spend years or decades living with Filipino or Indonesian without knowing anything substantial about them or about their culture. I think that is one diversity issue that Hong Kong needs to address. The other thing is that I agree totally with Bruce about network, and also Max also talked about social capital. Hong Kong people is obviously very good at networking, and it also helps by us being very close to each other, right? When it comes to having a drink or having lunch, people sometimes are just 15 minutes away, right? Compared with say in Bay Area, so I don't think you can call an impromptu drinks without say a few days notice in advance. But I think for a lot of networking, people sometimes are just for chit-chatting. Sometimes people are looking for business opportunities. I think there's a trend that has been that is upcoming in Hong Kong, which I think would need more encouragement. Is that people are starting together to talk about social causes, and that kind of grassroots movement is something that Hong Kong, I think, probably needs to work more on. grassroots movements, I would mean, say, people in the community getting together to talk about recycling scheme, for example, or people getting together to draw other people's attention about some of the heritage stories or some of the more disadvantaged neighborhoods in Hong Kong. I would like to see more of that happening here. It's slowly happening, but I think the trend is not strong enough for Hong Kong to become a really diversified, resilient community. I think resilience has to talk about some of the top-down initiatives, but it also has to be bottom-up. And I'm looking forward to a day where Hong Kong can really become a society where people like talking about their own community and is proud of their grassroots movements that are passionate to people themselves personally.
Thank you, Francis. I think I really echo with the point that grassroots movement and the bottom-up approach is just so empowering and so important. It makes you feel like you can act upon the decisions that not otherwise you will be able to influence over. So I think Hong Kong is starting to have more and more like-minded people together. But I would like to actually loop this back to Bruce, because you have experience living in both Bay Areas, and you also see the diversity, and you talk about there's lots of opportunities created in the diversity. But right, echoing the points that Francis brought up, that people are having more similarities, or they actually are influencing over their thoughts, so that we are not having the courage to voice out the different opinions. So how do we construct a platform, or how do we construct dialogue among people so that diversity can be leveraged on? Because that's also considered as the social innovation, as it innovate or reinvent the process of decision making, of co-creating the projects. So yeah, this is just a little follow-up question on the diversity.
Look, I think Francis hit on something that I could tell many stories, and I enjoy telling stories. But it does take courage, even at a place like Stanford or Booth, to put yourself in a room like a conference room that you normally shouldn't be in. And I mean, if Max and I want to go to an engineering lecture, we'll go to an engineering lecture, and we should be there. But we shouldn't often be, let's say, in a medical school lecture. So one time I found myself in a room invited by some PhDs who were researching how to clean up the water and sanitation in India. And it was this very elegant, biologically filtered, advanced technique for low-cost filtration of dirty water into clean water. And it was beautiful from what I could understand. I didn't understand it all. And then they get to the end of the lecture, 25 minutes in, and they say, this is a great chemistry. It works in the lab. And when we try to do it in the field, we would pay the people to truck the sludge out of the filter, and the truckers would take the sludge out of the village filters for the bad water and sanitation, and they throw it into the river down the stream and pollute the river again. And Max and I, we're pretty well behaved mostly. And so we would have sat there, as we did, and as I did, for about another 10 minutes. And then as a Wall Street lawyer and a Hong Kong banker, I couldn't resist. And I said, well, have you figured out that you should pay the truckers the value of the clean water, not the value of the sludge? And everybody looks at me like, you deserve a Nobel Prize for that question. And it's not a Nobel Prize question to people like us, like Max and Francis and I. It's a logical question, but it had never been asked by biological engineering type people. So I found myself now involved in trying to retrofit the slums of Fiji and Indonesia, 12 in Fiji, 12 in Indonesia, and figuring out a way economically to pay the people in those slums to take care of some of the waste. Well, I tell the story as the irony that it is. It's an ironic story. And there are thousands of ironic stories that should be happening when we put ourselves, as Francis says, when we have the courage that Max does to put himself in places that we frankly don't belong at all, right? But when we do that and we bring our own curiosity and our own goodwill to learn and to hear the problem, we react with our own experience and training, and we can't help ourselves. We're wired to do that as human beings. Well, if we never expose ourselves to the uncomfortable nature of being where we don't belong, those random connections, those random insights don't happen. And I can give you a second story, but I don't. I want to, leave time for everybody else's story. Anyway, you hear the point is that there are real benefits to mixing people together who come from different backgrounds and different career paths and different cultures of hearing the problem.
Oh, absolutely. I think that point is very well kind of embodied by lots of events that we have here in Hong Kong, like a hackathon. So you have people from engineering, development backgrounds, or entrepreneurs and designers. They have to tackle one problems or create one solution from different from their point of view, right? So you got this diversity of understanding of how can we create something more efficient. So that's a very good point, especially for Hong Kong today. People feel very comfortable in their comfort zone because the view is very. They have people around with the similar views, and they feel comfortable about. We feel comfortable about it. Yeah, I can speak for everybody. So yeah, so I would like to pass on to Max. Maybe you can also talk a little bit more about the technology part of social innovation. And what have you observed in Hong Kong or in Silicon Valley that you call a social innovation, and especially in this context of COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's many ways that people have seen technology. Technology, I think, by the people who have been benefited from from their education, from their application, see it as a powerful enabler, enabling us to have access to resources that otherwise would never have have at our disposal. And then at the same time, I think some people see technology as actually a monster, or as a force that's going to eat their lives. People who are actually at the receiving end of actually the transformation happening. To me, I think there was a story I heard recently. I think it's quite interesting, right? So it's about social media and the rise of social media as an industry. So in Hong Kong, we see that there are many workers actually from the Philippines who have come to Hong Kong and have basically devoted their lives to actually helping the citizens of Hong Kong go through their domestic work in exchange for actually receiving enough money to go and help their families back home. I recently came across a story of actually a young lady who is in the Philippines and has discovered that she can actually make a lot more money doing social media engagement, for example, Facebook and Instagram, than actually taking on this particular role. Right. In exchange, she gets to be in the Philippines, but she's now plugged into this global economy that is, frankly, very, it's like comparatively compared to other situations, much more money generating, and also more flexible. You don't have to actually, uproot yourself and go live in a foreign place in order to, have the sustained economy. So one idea I have that's sort of been thinking about is actually, if you have the proper connection to the internet economy, you're basically able now to live a life where your local production is now tied to this global sort of situation. And historically, the way the human economy has been set up is actually you're very conditional on your local surroundings. So if your local surroundings is very poor and doesn't have a lot of resources, you can't actually go and create something huge. So that's a new paradigm. Now, if we look at Hong Kong and think through the, sort of the potential aspects of Hong Kong, I think actually there is a chance to develop very interesting sort of virtual reality and augmented reality capabilities in the city, right? Not to say that there's, that's one aspect, because historically, Hong Kong has been constrained by its access to land and its access to natural resources, right? In some ways, it's actually closer, I think, to something like Israel or to Singapore, where you actually have to rely on the regional resources actually as the way to produce. And I personally believe that in some ways, this crush of the sort of difficulty of the physical situation is actually what gives birth to innovation. That's actually where new ideas are forced to come from, because you don't have any alternatives. And so there's one company actually here in Hong Kong called Sandbox, I think it's called Sandbox VR, that has actually done pretty successful tech development to actually build these sort of closed environments where you have full suit VR capabilities, and you can participate in video games and other entertainment mediums. But I personally believe that, just if we dive into that a bit more, like the space scarcity of Hong Kong might actually give us chances to create new types of social living, and educational capabilities, where we take the same technology of VR and we start applying it to the way that people can experience learning, to experience schools, and even experience, sort of recreational life, so that we're able to look past, the sort of material surroundings. And then the other thing I want to briefly touch on is the role that data is playing in social innovation as well. If we think about the way that people historically made strides about understanding human psychology, a lot of it was actually done in 50-person college campus surveys. The amount of papers and fundamental ground truth we've realized about human nature built on 50 people, college surveys is incredible. But I think today, with the ability actually to monitor, receive, and process the billions of interactions that happen on the internet, we actually have a chance to actually visualize the social fabric a lot more closer, and we can actually run huge scale, web scale social studies. Sometimes they're unintentional. I think the sort of fake news phenomenon on Facebook is actually it's almost like an accidental outgrowth of some of this technology misapplied. But at the same time, I think if we can find ways to more precisely and more real-timely survey the needs of the people that we're trying to serve through these social impact projects, then we can actually save huge amounts of funding, monetary expenditure, and even policy misdirection or good direction. You don't have to wait 2 years to realize that actually the new way that you're treating real estate housing is broken. You can actually get that feedback in a week. So I personally look forward to actually having more of a rich medium through which the citizens of a city can actually communicate their needs and desires and also capabilities to the the governors of the city, and that can help us accelerate faster innovation.
So I want to jump in, if it's okay, Jesse, to build on Max's point. So Con Edison, the utility in New York City, exploded a steam pipe in front of my building, sprayed 220 pounds with asbestos wrapping, and killed 3 people in my apartment building in New York. And I decided New York City needed a base map from the bedrock on which the city is built to the top of the trade towers. And long story short, I found them $100 million to build this map. And coming back to Max's point, the irony of our modern cities is that we throw away more data that we uncover every day of what we didn't know about how the cities were built than we could possibly generate each time we need to recall the information of how the city was rebuilt. And because we throw that data away, we create a lot of risk for adaptation of both buildings, but also neighborhoods and infrastructure. So there could be, to Max's point, a bounty or a tax reward for letting the data that you uncover about the history of how Hong Kong was built, how Central was built, Kowloon, whatever, how when you do a project, instead of hiding the data or putting it on someone's laptop who then disappears after the project is done, that goes into a central repository. I've called this the real estate operating system, or RIOS, for a city, and we can talk about that if you want. And it could be written such that each building in the blockchain has a perfect memory of itself, and that would transfer as people buy and sell and rent and insure buildings. Because right now the cities are really hamstrung and stymied in adapting. You know, you're going to have all these shopping malls in the US that can't have shopping people in them. They're going to have to adapt because of COVID. You want to make them into low income housing. The cost to figure out how to do that might be reduced by a third if you could recall how the buildings were actually built and maintained. So Max's point is really as an a technology memory of how the city itself was built and what adaptations it can support at low cost.
Yeah, I think, data is just something that we ignored, we overlooked, but its large amounts is very abundant in every city. And in the city of Hong Kong, the internet connectivity is more than 99%. So most of the people have a smartphone, and most of the people has a data plan. And even in the slum, in the refugee centers, or in homeless centers, as I always visit, everybody has at least one phone, and there's one guy who has two phones because he need to watch the soccer game, the football game at the same time as they play in a different region of the world. So I think this is a very important point. How do we leverage on the data for good, but also to avoid and be aware of the sensitivity, how the data is used. So yeah, Francis, I would like to ask you, do you echo the point? Do you think the data is leveraged in Hong Kong, especially in the context of COVID-19?
Yeah, I agree that the amount of data that is generated is still mind-blowing. And probably for most of the people in the world, and particularly in Hong Kong, we still don't appreciate the amount of data and the potential that the data can play in improving people's well-being. But one thing that I observed is that the data collection or data disclosure transparency regime can probably be enhanced. I think it should probably start with the government, but also with a lot of the commercial, social sector, that if there can be a central repository that Bruce has mentioned, and if the government can take the lead in releasing and organizing more of the data that the city generates, I think that will be a great opportunity for people to leverage on the data to do all the good things that can do for Hong Kong. So in my previous life, when I was with HSBC, I used to serve a trust and foundation for different countries, and I also helped them work with social enterprises and NGOs in different countries. And that gave me the opportunity of comparing the data quality and the way data were being organized in different countries. And I definitely see a big difference between how data was being handled in different parts of the world. I think that is one thing that Hong Kong definitely should be catching up. Yeah.
Yeah, but isn't it a risk if we act too aggressively on leveraging on data without a comprehensive structure in protecting the data privacy, right? The right use of the data. And I think this is a very sensitive topic also in Hong Kong, as people are more aware than in the mainland China about how the data was handled.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I agree totally with you. But on the other hand, I think there are plenty of supposedly neutral public data that should be made aware of. So back then, but the data that I was trying to collect is something like inflation data. or employment data. So I think supposedly those are things that should be in the public domain. But yeah, I also agree with you that personal data like personal information or your whereabouts or things that are being stored in your cell phone. I think yeah, those are the things that definitely need protection, and the legal regime has to be updated to in order to protect all of us.
So I think to build on Francis's point of privacy and yours too, Jesse, you know, it's one thing to as most of the credit information for consumers in the U.S. is handled without any of us knowing how it is handled. Okay. And huge decisions are made about not only do we get a loan, but the price of the loan, do we get employment, what are we paid based on all this data. So one way to deal with the increased access to data is to have increased access to the metadata of who used your data. And if you had the right to see who used your data, the folks who are using your data might not do it as often. The second thing is I was talking about the physical data. So how was the Mandarin Oriental Hotel built? You know, what are the footings and foundations for it? Do I ever have to worry when I'm having breakfast under the fish tanks that they're going to fall? And so that's much more innocuous because it's not as personal. It's situational. And those are the costs that ultimately result in repurposing neighborhoods, including poor neighborhoods, and how fast they can be repurposed or rebuilt. So to distinguish between the different types of data, but also since I was on the governor's task force for geospatial information and the federal agencies dealing with that, there are ways to make data use more accountable so that we can all make sure it's not used for bad purposes or invasive purposes.
It's very sensitive in this part of the world when we talk about, collaborating on the data usage. And we use the words very carefully. When you're talking to media, for example, or a commercial sector on collaboration, they actually see this as already a yield intention that you want to leverage on the data. So I think how to leverage, we have to learn a lot from different regions on what are the best practices, what is the infrastructure to protect the data misusage. So
Yes.
Move on to the next question, which is very, very crucial as we talk about, collaboration and the diversity. We have very diverse backgrounds in our community per se. We have more than 1,000 people in this community, and people are from entrepreneur, business, technology, or social work backgrounds. And how to really create a healthy and sustainable collaboration among the community is always a question we ask ourselves as community builders. So I would really love to learn from you as serial entrepreneurs, as scholars, and as as entrepreneurs yourself and investors. How do you see the collaboration can come into play in a city, affluent city like Hong Kong or San Francisco? How do you create a kind of platform where the different clusters can come together, especially in such a situation of a COVID, right? How do you create a platform and a forum? So Max, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I think, well, one is, Jesse, you've done already a great job with the SC meetup. I think you've managed to find some of the most passionate individuals across, all of Hong Kong. And now with your initiatives in California area, hopefully, being able to find another group of people there. And a few lessons I've learned actually in my own personal community building experiences. I sort of by accident started a group called One Salon when I was living in Stanford. At the beginning, it was just really to help me and a few close friends actually create a window outside of our daily working lives to sort of access and learn from other people. And very simply, the format was kind of like a TED Talk with your friends every week. And over the 74 weeks or so that we ran it in the beginning, we eventually grew it to a 700 plus community around Stanford area. And then from there, we sort of expanded now, at the height of our, international growth, we were in 13 cities around the world. And everyone who started a chapter had previously been to one or two of the salons and felt it sort of resonated with their own core values, and they sort of, did theirs as well. But I think what's really remarkable about this event and my journey through it is that we actually spent very little commercial dollars. I think in the whole course of the sort of 3 years I was very actively doing this, we spent maybe like $3,000 or $4,000 US, mostly on food, mostly concentrated in a few events. So what I think is interesting is, like, I think, and this is something we mentioned earlier, when people think about, resources, right? Like the willingness of individuals to contribute outside of their working mandated life into causes that they care about is actually a huge amount of force, right? Like in Hong Kong, there's this, great program called Time Auction. And I think Time Auction is helping start to understand and structure the sort of volunteer time that actually is latent in the community. And also through SE Meetup, I think you have many people who have a day job and they also have night jobs, and the night jobs perhaps even are more engaged to them than their day jobs are. So I am a big fan and believer that we need to start recognizing this as actually another dimension of a city or community's potential. And the more people that can volunteer and be recognized for their volunteering efforts, the more vibrant the stuff is. A lot of times culture is not something we fund directly, but it's sort of funded indirectly, right? And that's actually, part of the magic of, I think, of societal creation.
Yeah, that's amazing. How do you see, social innovators play the role in actually working collectively with people from different sectors in your community? I'm just very curious in your past experience.
Yeah, well, I think social innovators in general usually start out with we start out with a close affinity to a problem. I think that's really one of the genesis qualities, and unfortunately, most times they don't start out with either the money or the other things to try to solve it. But that's actually why it's it's like social impact entrepreneurship. The whole point of entrepreneurship is to do things you don't have the resources today to do. Otherwise, it would just be a project, right? And I think what great social innovators do is that they become advocates of the particular problem in a way that is very articulate and resonates with the stakeholders. And just by purely connecting the dots between 5 or 6 different stakeholders, the social innovator has now created a collaboration that was not possible or did not exist naturally before. And that collaboration is actually, hopefully going to solve the problem. So I see social innovators as actually, people who can very agilely understand the dynamics of the different stakeholders of the ecosystem, right? And then from there, be able to bring them together.
Yeah, Francis, do you agree?
Yeah.
How you see the collaboration social innovators has with other different sectors?
Yeah, I agree. Speaking of platform that Jesse has asked, I think a forum like this is very helpful to get people from different backgrounds, different countries, with different kinds of organizations talking together and try to understand each other about what are in their mind, what the challenges are, what the plans are, and sometimes challenges for one sector is probably an opportunity for the others. So yeah, being in this space for a number of years, I'm always fascinating by social entrepreneurs or nonprofits telling me that no, I'm looking for money. I don't have any channels to raise money, whereas the investors, the foundations are telling me that, Francis, do you have anyone to recommend? We have so much money that we don't know where to spend, right? So I think channels like this are always helpful. The other thing is that I think the sectors should also learn to speak others' language. You have to understand where people come from before there can be meaningful communication. So a story of mine is that when I was with HSBC, that's a very kind-hearted entrepreneur who set up a foundation and told me that they want to support an organization which do palliative care. So we invited that the team to come and to meet that entrepreneur. And that palliative care team spent 10 minutes talking about, the background, why palliative care is needed and stuff. And then my client, with that 20-page proposal in his hand, actually skip that part of background and flip to the last page and look at the numbers. And he said that, oh, the numbers doesn't seem to add up. And then luckily, that entrepreneur gave opportunities for that organization to revise the numbers. And in the end, he funded that organization. But that shows that when people are speaking different languages and that they have different priorities, sometimes people can stop communicating with each other. And on the other hand, I also heard stories about nonprofits complaining to me that some of the private bankers are so arrogant that they don't want to listen to what other people are saying, and they are always thinking about money, and that they're thinking that banking people are sort of superior. So yeah, I think it's important to really understand where people are coming from, what their standpoints are, what their challenges are, and I think people like us who try to be worldly, try to absorb and learn from different sectors, we play an important role of being a sort of translator for different people to try to create a more understanding sector where people can work with each other.
Yeah, Bruce, do you agree in the San Francisco area? Do you see also there are lots of bridges and translator, or people still are kind of working in silos?
So there's a little bit of both. I have to second the motion that Francis gives that bankers can tend to be perceived as arrogant, to know it all, to know a narrow bit of whatever they think they know. Some parts of it's really important to listen to what Francis just said. What we do as social entrepreneurs, you, Jesse, Max, all of us, what we do is we become like the United Nations translation service for different cultural ways of seeing the problem. And we become, because we've been told no so often, we figure out what are the frequently asked questions, the FAQs, how to present a version of whatever the story is of the change we want to make to anticipate the most FAQs. And then we take each no as the most helpful reaction we could have gotten, and we solve the problem. And I could give you many stories of how I've used the no, because once I heard the no, I responded to the person in authority who told me the no, that said, if I answer your question and I can get to yes, what will you do for me? And here's a very big difference, I will tell you, between the mainland Chinese that we see here in San Francisco and the Hong Kongese that I know, and others in Asia who I know. There is a style of discussion that mainland Chinese business people, particularly, but also government people, have perfected, where they want to see if I'm as smart as I think I am. And they will ask 1,000 questions. It's death by 1,000 questions. And if I answer all 999, and the one last one is to be asked and answered, by then they will know everything about the strategy I wanted to pursue, and they will never use it with me. And they will say, well, you were the idiot who answered the 999 questions, so why would we want to work with you? You were so stupid, Bruce, to do that. That is why we cannot have any of the professional development people at Stanford, when we do these professional development conferences for executives, I cannot bring tech and other entrepreneurs to meet with the mainland Chinese because they know that it's just a question of giving over their trade secrets. The spirit of answering and asking questions when you're trying to create something new together is a very obvious emotional human reaction. When you're just being pumped for information, that's not dialogue, that's interrogation. And so we as social entrepreneurs know when our time has been wasted by someone trying to act as if they could fund us when they really are just trying to amuse themselves with us. So you develop a pretty thick skin about why you're going to talk to someone, and is it really worth you? Will you learn anything from them? And if you will, is it about money? Is it about what's wrong with my strategy? What do you learn? And if you don't learn from them, then don't bother. Also, to your point, we do talk across our cultural norms here. And I'll give you a very quick example of that, which is a tough example, but an example. So about 15 weeks ago, I am Jewish, and on Saturdays I would normally go to synagogue and study the Bible, study the Torah. And on this particular Saturday in the parking lot were 4 SWAT cars. SWAT being the special weapons and tactics people who respond to terrorists, because we've had a rash of synagogue bombs here in the States. And I went up to the lieutenant and got to talking, and long story short, we ended up, I did a personal finance management workshop over 8 weeks for his people. And then COVID happens, and I get a call, Bruce, I need to have UVC lights, ultraviolet C lights, to disinfect the gear, including all the gear that they carry. And I was able, through friends as a social entrepreneur, to get donated $25,000 worth of LED UVC lights. But then we have to measure, does the light output, is it the right bandwidth and the right energy? And I got donated another $5,000 of spectrometer from a different source. Well, here's the head of a major wealthy community in the Bay Area who didn't have what he needed to disinfect his and his team's gear. And a social entrepreneur such as myself, because we know how to, convince other people to do what we need and to donate resources, was able within about 3 weeks to get that gear. So, that's the kind of, would I ever normally run into a SWAT team at synagogue, except for a neo-Nazi who triggered this response, thankfully? And could I ever repay their response and willingness to respond, except by being the whole person that I am as a social entrepreneur? So when Francis and Max are talking about, being all of yourself, listening with a full heart, knowing how to respond as a human being to situations, those are things we love to be because it stretches us, but it is a unique talent that we develop to be able to do it. And it's a lot of fun, as you hear, because the stories are many and we could all tell our stories.
That's a beautiful story. I mean, not all beautiful, but it's a good, beautiful conclusion.
It has a good ending, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as social entrepreneurs, we eat no as breakfast, and the more no's we have, the more appreciate, the more gratitude you have towards it, because I think I see 2 things in the no's that we hear from people. One is that we know what doesn't work, or how should we. Maybe we should improve on our pitch or our proposal to make it work. And the second is really build your is a personality builder. Basically, you develop a thick skin, and you'll be able to to be more like persistent, and you have to go through more no's until it works. So I think as social entrepreneurs, we really see this whole journey as a holistic. We don't just take one no as the end of our journey, but we can actually really persevere and to really work until it works. Yeah, so I think that's a great story. I would like to ask, Max and Francis and also Bruce, maybe one last question before we open the floor. It's actually really quick, but it's very important because we're facing the new challenge after the post-COVID. Actually, COVID is still ranging on, but we have the top-down policies that could change the landscape of the cities. And I'm sure the same in the San Francisco area, where you also have the political kind of will from the top down that can really change the projects, that shape the projects or the context of the projects. So how can we act as social entrepreneurs, as a social innovators within this huge structure and imposition of the new policies? How would you advise everyone to go about it? Stay optimistic, but what else can we do? It's very stress on the individual level. And we talk a lot about this in the community because we want social innovation to be not only about a community, but also to be a way to sustain ourselves emotionally, financially, if not more. So yeah, I would love to address this problem to all of you. Maybe Max, you can talk a little bit more about your experience.
Yeah, well, I think that the social entrepreneurship community is something that sort of springs organically, actually, from individuals recognizing that there is a problem. And I think one of the really remarkable things is that the tools we have to sort of convene people, especially post-COVID, has actually been very democratized, right? Zoom has given us this new, almost like social network upon which we can actually meet new friends and see old friends and collaborate more interactively across time zones. I actually want to maybe switch the question a little bit and actually think, sort of devote my maybe concluding remarks actually around the idea of like what we should actually look forward to, right? COVID has actually shaken the world dramatically, right? So we need to think about what new models we want to establish and what old models we need to retire. And I think that for a lot of times, a lot of people, like the question of whether or not all the needs of a community are being met before was kind of like it was almost like playing chicken. Like you drive a car close to the edge and you try to drive as close as you can without actually falling off the cliff, right? And what we see now with sort of a whole wide range of populism movements across the world is that the unmet needs of the general people are becoming very vocal in their expression. And I think that's really a universal phenomenon. This is not something that is only localized to one particular place or one particular region. It's actually something that we see, in many different shapes and forms, from the Philippines to, Chile, to France, to the United States, to Hong Kong, and we continue. And so I think as this sort of uprising happens, not uprising, as articulation happens, like the ability of social entrepreneurs really to become this spokespeople of this unmet need is actually critical, right? Because for most times people are, on the reception side, they're not really understanding fully the contours of why these people are unhappy, because the decision makers usually are coming from positions where they have, sufficient amounts of financial and also, physical security. And I think in some ways this is a crisis in the making. It's a global crisis, but also it's a global opportunity for social entrepreneurs to really respond to. And I think that we need more educational programs, both formal and informal, to actually share with the people in the community exactly how to understand, and respond. And I think that's really exciting, because in some ways it also is one of the most historic processes, right? Like over the next few years, we're going to see, really a crossroads. On one hand, if technology really continues to, sort of advance on this, breakneck pace, is actually going to completely become unshackled or sort of separated from the needs of the actual people. And on the other hand, you have, companies that are earning billions of dollars in profits, who, if they were to reinvest that profit into people, like that would actually become, a very significant hedge towards irrelevance. And I don't think at the end of the day that people want to, like people are fundamentally very resilient. As humans, we've seen a lot of different challenging scenarios. We've seen wars, we've seen famines, and so on. And so I think the will for people to survive and continue to thrive is very strong. And so I think it's a mistake for policymakers and also people who are reaping the huge amount of gains of globalization to actually overlook the resilient nature of the general people. And then the final thing I would say is, especially my work in climate change, one thing I've been continuing inspired by is actually the willingness of the individuals actually to respond to the challenge. I think a lot of times, the climate problem has been recognized for almost 40, 50 years. And one of the reasons we haven't done enough is actually because the people who have been given the mantle of authority have actually procrastinated, right? And especially going to the last conference of the parties, the UN convention, the general 14, 15-year-old, there was so articulate, so well informed, had both scientific knowledge and also, social stakeholder knowledge about how change should be made. And in some ways, I think the cost of optimism in responding to climate change is going to come again from this general populational effort, right? Being able to channel this energy into effective decision making or effective communication to governments is going to be our key driver.
Yeah, Francis, do you find that's something you also had in mind, to translate, kind of amount of the energy that the civil sector has into effective decision making, right, into social innovation process or products? Is that something that you also have in mind?
Yeah. I think it's important for social entrepreneurs to do something, right? To start making impact, and probably in some cases don't be too greedy about. Of course, you have to have vision in mind, you have to have models in mind, but I think a good way to get recognition and build trust is to start doing something and make impact, especially when in places and in society where social sector or social innovators and social entrepreneurs are still, either being misunderstood or that when people are still not understanding a lot about what social entrepreneurship or social innovation is about, I think it's even more important for them to really make a mark and do something to, however in a small way, to make an impact in society. I think that's also a way to build trust, to let people know that you are genuine, that you are here to do something. And it's also a way to build relationship, to really know about the community and to get useful information in order to chart your next step. So we talked about a lot of the challenges that are brought by, political debates, that are brought by aftermath, or the suffering that people are ongoing with COVID. I think it's even more important to, establish a place by doing something concrete and to build trust from grassroots, from foundation. Sometimes people would be willing to see you as trustworthy if they know you personally, if they see that you are really doing something genuinely, not for your own interest, but for the wider societal interests. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, Bruce, you also worked with the different sectors, NGOs and governments, so to say, right? And do you see this process of trust building easy in your part of the world? Is that what people recognize you as genuine? Is there something difficult for you?
After a while, it isn't difficult to be the subject of ridicule. You sort of enjoy it. You think everybody is amusing you by doing that. So an example, and Max can relate to this. I have a student from Paraguay in my ethics of finance class, and he says, Professor, it's so bad in Paraguay because we have so much corruption in Latin America. We just have, it's very hard to do business. And he tells me the story of his family and the rest of it. And well, why can't we have a venture capital fund in Paraguay? I said, well, all kinds of reasons, but a big reason is that with the corruption, the business that you would create takes 10 to 25% of the profit. So we keep talking, and another, the head of innovation for Paraguay is at the Stanford Business School, and we meet with her, and we come up with the idea of an anti-corruption fund for Paraguay. And we start talking about an anti-corruption fund for Paraguay. And he goes back home and he comes back to campus and he says, you know, people are a little worried that we talk about anti-corruption as if there's corruption. I said, well, there is corruption. So what's so wrong about saying that we're doing an anti-corruption fund? Well, long story short, we figure out that corruption is like a compass, a magnetic compass, and that it points to the north to say, pay the bribe, pay whatever you have to pay to stay in business. But the needle on the compass also at the same time points south, away from paying the bribe. So to Max's point, if I have to pay a bribe to connect to the official electricity grid, maybe I go solar and I don't connect to the grid. If I have to pay a bribe to connect to the official telephone system, maybe I don't connect to the official telephone system, I connect to the satellite, and so on. And so this whole idea of being told, well, you know, I'm surprised that there's corruption going on here and you would want to have an anti-corruption fund. I can't imagine why you would do that. Turned into, well, every time we find corruption, we find a way to avoid it. And we just need to fund those people and those businesses who want to join us and take an anti-corruption pledge to do that. So the point of that story, Jesse, aside from the fun of it, is to explain that you have to think across cultures. You have to think how to be in somebody's face. And being from Philadelphia and New York, I don't find that very hard. To take them on, and to where they think they are so powerful and right and can convince you you're naive, and you just take them on and say, well, not really. It's kind of like the young boy trying to get the truck through the tunnel and letting the air out of the tires. We can do this, and I think we don't know that we're being non-traditional, so we just want to do it, and that's gives us the power because we have the courage to do that every day, and we meet fun people like you all.
That's a very encouraging story. And I hope we have more fun people who can just have a very thick skin and always come out and do things. I think that's really the spirit we need in the community. So having said that, I want to have some bold people and thick-skinned people to ask questions. But apparently today, everyone enjoying the panel discussion so much that we don't have a question in the chat box. But please do send us questions in our community chats or through the Meetup platform if you have anything to follow up. Oh yes, we have a huge question. But unfortunately, I will record this question, and unfortunately we are running out of time. So today is a fantastic program. We've been learning so much from the speakers at system level. How should we react collectively, and as individual level, how should we react as social innovators? How do we develop our thick skins, right? And to really work towards our mission and through our moral compass. So I would really like to say a big thank you to all our distinguished speakers today. And yeah, we got lots of questions. Thanks, guys, for sending it last minute. Yeah, we'll be able to follow up later on through the email and through the platform. But thank you so much for joining us. And again, this is a new series of webinar called Bay to Bay. We'll have regular events across the 2 bays to learn from the speakers, not just in our context, but really to communicate across the regions. And the goal of it is to build social entrepreneurship as a lifestyle, as a spirit, so more people will be able to come out and act upon what they think is important to them and to the society. But this is the end of our program. Unfortunately, we have a fantastic discussion, and thank you everyone for joining. So please
Thank
give
you,
us
Jesse.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and to you,
Thank you,
Max.
Bruce, Max,
Come on
and
back
Thank you,
soon.
Jesse.
thank you,
And
Jesse.
Thank you, Francis and Bruce.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.